So what we have is pretty much like what's happening around Europe. It's a con job taking place. The citizens of Europe are being frog marched into deeper and deeper European defence integration against their will. As Mick said, the people have no appetite for this, but they're being told that that's the only show in town. And the establishment in Ireland is going along with that, not because they have to, but because they want to be the best little Europeans in class. There's also a rumour that some of our leadership want a nice job in Europe out at the end of it.
Hello everybody, and welcome to a very special issue of the monthly Daily, where we follow the many political battles of Clare Daly and Mick Wallace as they stand up against warmongering and hypocrisy in the West. Last week, I had the special privilege of talking to both of them directly. Unfortunately, Zoom let us down a little bit, so the audio and video quality is not top-notch, but I hope you still enjoy it. We started off with the question what their recent neutrality event was all about that they held on June 24th in Dublin.
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing to say is the reason for the meeting, and it was one of a number in cities all over Ireland, was to coincide with the decision of our foreign minister to launch what he called consultation forums about the future of our neutrality. Now, they weren't in any way to consult at all. They were set up in a manner in which these so-called experts would sit up at the top panel chatting amongst themselves about these incredibly important issues that the ordinary people could have no concept of understanding, of course. And we were supposed to basically come out of that with a preordained outcome. Like the speakers were stacked with US and military think tanks, people who would be very much in favour of EU militarism and with practically no voice for anybody who supports neutrality at all. So the whole event was framed in the sort of background that we're in a changing world. We had neutrality before. It's very selfish. It's an old luxury. We can't afford it anymore. Whereas that is just absolute nonsense as far as we're concerned. Actually, it's the opposite. There is a need now more than ever for countries to be neutral and unaligned. And actually, against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, we see now that the majority of the world's countries, which contain the majority of the world's populations, are very much in that camp. And we felt that Ireland could be uniquely, I suppose, poised as a Western European country, very pro-American in its dealings, very linked in with American culture, but actually haven't been colonized and having that sympathy and understanding with the countries who are in the non-aligned movement. So that was the sort of framing of our event, to defend Irish neutrality as not something that's insular or background, but actually something that is the hallmark of the most radical and best tradition of international solidarity, really.
Yeah, I suppose it's Claire was highlighting the nature of the panelists that were chosen for the forums in Cork, Galway and Dublin. And there was really no people of an independent nature asked to speak. We applied to speak, but we weren't allowed. I don't think they like what we have to say. And it was so obvious. Not only were the panel incredibly biased towards a more militaristic Europe and supporting the whole agenda of US empire, but on top of that, you had the crowd was also laced with people of the same ilk. So what you had was the people in the crowd were, and you had to get a ticket to get in, right? But they were predominantly from the civil service sector. They actually worked for the government, and most of them behaved as cheerleaders on the day. And I went to the event in Cork and Galway. Claire went to the Dublin one as well. She went to all three. And we both got to speak for a couple of minutes in Cork. We weren't allowed to speak in Galway, and Claire wasn't allowed to speak in Dublin either. The point we're trying to make is that this was very much a staged event, and but we spoke at events outside on the streets in Cork. We spoke on the streets in Galway, and we had our own event in Dublin. And it's very obvious that the people are in a very much a different space to the politicians. So what we have is we have the political class and the corporate media promoting this militarization of Europe, promoting the war in Ukraine, promoting anything that the Americans get up to. But it's not what the people want. And I don't know whether you've seen it before, but Clare and myself put in an amendment twice in the last 6 months on the Ukraine war in Strasbourg here. And each time we called on the EU to maximize its potential to bring about dialogue and diplomacy with a view to ending the war and establishing peace. And 80% of the politicians are voting against it. So they're actually wanting war. But we know from different polls that have been taken around Europe, over 80% of the people of Europe want peace. And a poll in Ireland showed that 87% of the people of Ireland actually wanted peace. But if you turn on your television set or open your newspapers in Ireland, you would swear that the whole country was loving the war, and that we think that they thought it was a great idea. Corporate media and the political class have been pushing the militarization of Europe. They've been pushing this war in Ukraine. They've been pushing NATO, and yet it's not what the people want. The people are on a different page. The political class and the media do not represent the public of Europe, and that is very obvious at this stage.
What would it take in Ireland to loosen your triple lock, or to even get completely rid of neutrality? Would it take a popular referendum to do so?
Unfortunately, it wouldn't, right? So, I mean, I think what we've seen, and around the events that we were talking about, which were stage managed by the government, they weren't the normal citizens' assembly that the government has when they're looking at changing policy, about genuinely engaging in a real cross-section of the public. This wasn't that. As we said, it was very much stage managed. But our president intervened around the time and warned about the slippery slope towards NATO and how dangerous that was. And that had a sort of an electrifying effect on all of the population who got up to defend our neutrality. Now, you say, well, what does that mean? Well, we have a peculiar situation whereby while we're neutral, it's not in our constitution. We do have in our constitution the responsibility to resolve conflict by peaceable means, but it's not actually in our constitution. It's more the tradition that the country has always had, mainly because we were colonized by Britain. That's the main reason behind it. But unfortunately, things like the triple lock, which is the basis upon which we send our troops abroad. Now, this is something that in Ireland can only happen if the government, the parliament, and it's a UN mission. So the three things have to be in place before Irish troops can go abroad. But that's only a piece of legislation. So that can be changed by the people in the parliament. And the three parties in government at the moment have all said they're prepared to look at that. So what we have is pretty much like what's happening around Europe. It's a con job taking place. The citizens of Europe are being frog-marched into deeper and deeper European defence integration against their will. As Mick said, the people have no appetite for this, but they're being told that that's the only show in town. And the establishment in Ireland is going along with that, not because they have to, but because they want to be the best little Europeans in class. There's also a rumour that some of our leadership want a nice job in Europe out at the end of it. The Irish people don't want that. So what they're doing is being the victims of a sleight of hand. So the government, I've no doubt, are going to come out with this process and say, of course we're neutral. We're not going to change our neutrality. And of course, we're not going to join NATO, but we do need to do a lot more in terms of cooperating with our European like-minded partners to defend ourselves against cybersecurity, to protect our cables, this type of nonsense. And we saw announced yesterday that the Irish government is going to get involved in 4 military exercises, so-called protecting private cables off our shores now. So they don't need to go to the people, but if they were to nominally kill neutrality, there would be nearly a revolution to defend it. But you have this kind of double standard, because even with us being neutral, they still allow the US military use our civilian airports to go through Shannon. And that's something that we've said is an abomination and shouldn't happen. So actually the background to this has kind of energized people into saying, do you know what, this sort of Schleveen neutrality, a nod and a wink neutrality isn't good enough. We want real active neutrality. And that has energized people more to defend that now.
Yeah, it's very easy to make the case that Ireland is a small country. At present, we spend 0.2% of our GDP on defence, but we have serious challenges with our housing. We have a housing crisis that's for over 10 years. We have serious challenges with our health service. We have abysmal public transport. We're under huge pressure to meet our environmental targets, and there's a lot of investment needed to take place. And now we have these guys looking to spend more on defence in order to get on page with that militaristic element across Europe. But the idea that Ireland, this idea that, as Clare said at the start there, that neutrality is a luxury we can't afford anymore, when in actual fact, the opposite is true. We can't possibly afford to go down the other path. And Ireland, being a small country, we have great potential to play a real positive role as a neutral country. We have so few countries clamoring for peace in Ukraine today. Instead, countries are afraid to even call for peace. And a small country like Ireland can make a difference at this stage. We cannot make a difference militarily. We're not going to build a serious army. It isn't possible. So we're wasting our time trying to play the military games. Apart from the fact that they're a load of nonsense anyway, they're just it's a way of funneling money into the military industrial complex. But it makes no sense for Ireland to go down the military path. It makes an awful lot of sense for Ireland to be a peaceful nation, a neutral nation, trying to promote peace and harmony in the world at every opportunity. So there is no common sense whatever to Ireland actually adopting a military position.
But Mick and Clare, I think you're not getting it. I mean, peace for Ukraine means more weapons, right? As Stoltenberg said, weapons are the way to peace. And what we need is more meat, right? We need as much meat as possible, because the Ukrainian meat is actually running out. And we can see how this push toward, okay, more people need to get engaged. So just throw as many troops at it as possible. So you're saying Ireland should not participate in the meat grinder?
It's amazing. Of course we are. And we think not only do Irish people agree with that, but a majority of people across Europe believe it as well, although many of them have been bullied into staying quiet about that. I mean, we've just come from a voting session in the European Parliament, where the Parliament voted to again send ammunition to Ukraine, emergency suspension of means to get all of those bullets across. I think 25 people voted against it. 25 out of 705 MEPs voted against that. Just there a few, because they are disconnected from reality, because they are in hock to the military-industrial complex that is battening down the doors here all the time with this nonsense that somehow militarism makes people safer, when the reality is that we have the biggest war on the continent of Europe since World War II, against the backdrop precisely of a growing militarism in Europe. So it's not true to say the more militarism you have, the safer we'll be. The more militarism you have, the more unsafe we will be. And that's what's happened with Ukraine as well. It is, as you say, the Ukrainian men are into the meat grinder, and that's all they care about.
Yeah, but it should also be said, a big factor at play is the role of mainstream media. And I don't think that all the MEPs have been got to by the lobbyists for the military-industrial complex. Obviously, some of the main players in the groups may have been, but the corporate media is playing a very negative role, and it has been promoting the war from the start. And it has been demonizing anyone that has the audacity to look for peace. And we have made clear from the very start, we condemn the invasion. It's illegal to invade another country. It's a breach of the UN Charter. We condemn the Russian invasion from the start. We understand that it was provoked, and that's why it's called the unprovoked war, as it was provoked. But that doesn't mean that it was still illegal for Russia to invade Ukraine. And we have condemned that invasion. But we have refused to take sides in the war. We want peace. And we have appealed morning, noon, and night for negotiations and diplomacy to start. Not one effort has been made by the European Union in 16 months to commence dialogue and diplomacy. Not one effort. And anyone that dares, like we have, anyone that dares to call for peace is written off as a Putin puppet, right? So we're not taking sides, but because we're not taking the side of the US NATO proxy war, we're accused of being Putin puppets because we want peace. This is the way of the corporate media, and we've been lambasted in the media in Ireland, absolutely lambasted. So you can understand why MEPs wouldn't quite like to get into the space that we're in. They don't want to be demonized. They don't want. There's an election coming in less than a year, right? In Europe, we've elections next June, and they don't want the mainstream media criticizing them for doing something like calling for peace. So people, they're intimidated by the media, and they won't say things that the media won't like. So that's one of the reasons why they're voting so badly in the parliament.
The one thing that I just can't wrap my head around is how is it possible that we have nominally a free media, and I do think we have a free media all over Europe, more or less, but they are so kowtowed into one narrative that they completely disregard all of the stuff that makes no sense. That Russia is accused of attacking its own infrastructure, that they are saying, oh, we need NATO in order to protect these undersea cables, when in fact NATO is not even able to protect Nord Stream 2. On the contrary, NATO probably blew it up. These contradictions are so glaring, and they're getting bigger day by day. So are you feeling that they are under pressure to kind of justify their own narrative, the box that they have put themselves into, or something else at play?
Well, I suppose, first of all, we don't have a free media. We don't think that we do. I mean, we've constantly made the point that the United States brags about the fact that it funds so-called independent media on every continent of the globe and all around the world. So that absolutely includes Europe as well, that US money is funding media in Europe. You have US-based think tanks, which are the go-to people for all policy decisions inside the European Union. Now, we have said repeatedly, these people are entitled to their opinion. It's their view. They're entitled to it. But please don't pretend that it is an independent view. It isn't. It's a view supporting NATO or US empire or whatever. So we don't have a free media, unfortunately. We're in the midst of a huge crisis in Ireland at the moment, where the state broadcaster has been caught out in spending a lot of money off the books on slush funds for celebrity journalists and so on, while decent journalists are working out of cafe toilets, really. So you have a mixed model where there isn't enough public money going in for decent journalism. So we don't think you have a free media. But are they under pressure? I think the narrative is shifting a little bit. Not nearly enough, but a little bit. There are some stories about maybe the Ukrainians not being the angels that they're painted out to be. And that's the beginning now of a softening of an attitude of whereby there is going to be need to have some sort of talks. We've seen the stories about the US administration talking behind the scenes with the Russians. I've no doubt that's going on. Obviously, we had Zelensky's performance at NATO, whinging that Ukraine weren't being admitted tomorrow into NATO. Ukraine are never going to be admitted into NATO. Let's be clear about it. They are being used. So I think, yeah, there is a pressure to slightly shift the narrative, and we do see some members of parliament beginning to shift, but it's very clear that those who are promoting the proxy war don't want it to end just yet. While there's enough meat to go into the grinder for a bit longer. I mean, you may have seen the article in the Financial Times last week, which we had the Ukrainian defense minister bragging that this was the best training ground, if you like, for experimenting with military hardware, that this was the first time that NATO weaponry was being allowed to be tested against the Russian administration, and that there was the best training ground they could possibly have. Where would you get such experience? It was heartbreaking to think that, but they were actually that brazen about it. Yeah.
And I mean, listen, you asked about the independent media, right? I mean, there's very little independent media anywhere, and it isn't just a problem in Europe. I mean, the media wouldn't be independent in Russia, it wouldn't be independent in China, it's not independent in America, and it's not independent in Europe, right? I mean, you have to look at who owns the media, who controls it. They have a vested interest in shaping the news rather than telling it exactly as it is. So it's always been difficult to have independent media. It was probably more prominent in the past, but it's been pretty scarce of late. And, the very fact that mainstream media across Europe have been so reluctant to stand up for Julian Assange tells you a lot. Julian Assange is in prison in Belmarsh, a high security prison now for over 5 years, not because he committed a crime, but because as a journalist, he exposed the truth about US and NATO war crimes, right? And he's locked up. So anyone that dares to challenge the narrative is liable to be locked up and mightn't be let out again. So it's a real lesson for journalists that you need to behave yourself. And the fact that other media will not even defend Assange and stand up for him, this is an incredibly important case for journalism, and they are silent about it. Now that's that's very problematic. But I mean, look at it's always been difficult to get an honest story anyway. I mean, people with money generally own the media as well. I mean, it's very hard for you or I to start a newspaper or a television station. It's an expensive business. So most people that control the media have a vested interest in looking after elites.